Here at the Society spring from the wealth of information discovered by researchers in our collection. It's amazing what territory that people think they've been over many, many times will produce through the eyes of a new researcher and interest of a new researcher. And this is certainly an example tonight. While researching an earlier book about his family history, our speaker this evening, John Sedgwick, was shown a remarkable letter in the Society's collection written by Alexander Hamilton and sent to Theodore Sedgwick, John's great-great-great-great-grandfather. I have too many greats, the number of greats? Grandfather. This letter was written the night before Hamilton rode across the Hudson to the dueling ground, and most likely the last letter Hamilton ever wrote. It is on display at the front here. Peter has a display of it with other related material, and we invite you up to see it after the program. While this letter has been little appreciated by historians, a speaker has come to believe that more than any other single document, it describes Hamilton's reasons for risking his own life to end Burr's. The encounter with the letter became the inspiration for John's book, which we're going to learn more about tonight. And that book that was inspired is The War of Two. In a recent review, Kate Tuttle of the Boston Globe said, "Sedgwick writes elegantly and eloquently, sketches with great compassion both the brilliant, self-created Hamilton, an immigrant of illegitimate birth and boundless ambition, and the equally brilliant Burr, an American aristocrat, grief-haunted, private, composed of contradictions." I think many of you will be familiar with our speaker tonight. He's spoken here before. He's written several books, including the memoir, In My Blood, and articles for such publications as The Atlantic, GQ, Newsweek, and Esquire. And he was nominated for a National Magazine Award for a story on the country's finest nonprofit organizations. Did we make it into that article? I can't remember. Anyway, and number one, thank you. Anyway, John Sedgwick.
Dennis, thank you very much. Gosh, the glare up here is wonderful. I mean, I feel terrific to be addressing this multitude, but then to imagine the multitudes that C-SPAN is going to reach even beyond the walls here is staggering for me. I'm also reminded as I see you that there is this famous adage about Bostonians that they would much rather hear a lecture about heaven than visit it themselves. And I think it's in that spirit that I've gotten you all to turn out tonight. I hope this is heavenly, let's say. Okay, Dennis, of course, has stolen a lot of my thunder here. I have really nothing left to say. But I will underscore what Peter Drummey has asked me to say, which is that the letter that is the source and fount of all of this wisdom of mine is up here on the case, and you really should look at it. It's just a marvel to see, and I'll talk about it more when I get into what I have to say, but it's... The whole beauty and privilege of this institution is that these documents are here to touch. And there's nowhere else that you can go. The internet just doesn't do this. That to actually make contact with the past in this fashion is so rare and wonderful, and it is so inspiring for writers and scholars that I want to pay tribute to this institution above all others. It is number one in all nonprofits. And just to elaborate a little bit on the scene that Dennis was alluding to, that it was years ago. I was doing my In My Blood book, the book about the history of my family, and I was wading through all of the. Not all of them, by God, but some of the select papers that the Sedgwicks have, from the Sedgwick family, that are stored here, making it, in fact, one of the largest family collections in the nation, to my astonishment. And that at the end of it, he was telling me that, in fact, Peter was, that there was a letter that I really should see. And it was actually outside of the scope of what I was working on at the time, but he said, come on, we've got this one on display up front. And it was the sort of whispery, conspiratorial way that he said it that, of course, captured and held my attention. And he brought me over to this letter, and he pointed to it. And, of course, it was the way he told it. It was just a letter. So I looked down at it, this wrinkled letter, yellowed with age, once black ink. You know how the black ink, all the ink here is brown, not because it was written brown, but because it's turned brown over time. So that what you're seeing is the age of it by its coloration. And so he says, there, take a look. And I look at it, and I bend over the case, and I read out, New York, July 10, 1804. My dear sir, I have received 2 letters from you since we last saw each other, that of the latest date being the 24th of May. I have had in hand for some time a long letter to you explaining my view of the course and tendency of our politics and my intentions as to my own future conduct. But my plan embraced so large a range that owing to so much avocation, some indifferent health, and a growing distaste for politics, the letter is still considerably short of being finished. I write this now to satisfy you that want of regard for you has not been the cause of my silence. Wait, I said, this isn't... And Peter says, yeah, this is Alexander Hamilton's last letter, written the night before he was shot, by the sitting Vice President Aaron Burr, needless to say, in the famous duel at Weehawken in 1804, an event that Henry Adams called the single most dramatic moment in the politics of the early republic. And look, he said, it's to one of yours, his good friend and legislative ally, Theodore Sedgwick. Of course, the name was scrawled across the top. Staggering. I'd known about the letter, but I'd never seen it. Theodore was my great-great-grandfather, a lawyer and a politician. He was the founder of our branch of the Sedgwick family. He had built a fine federal-style house in the Berkshires that's still owned by the family, in a place where I go regularly, lovely home, and had nearly been killed in the Shays' Rebellion that took him as a rich, plump lawyer as one of its more detestable targets. He'd helped push Hamilton's economic agenda through the House when he was a representative from Massachusetts, and ultimately rose to become Speaker of the House for the fateful election of 1800 that wrested control away from his Federalist Party and turned it over to Thomas Jefferson, a man that he openly referred to as the Antichrist, and his Republican Jacobins, as he thought of them. Much to Hamilton's distress, Theodore had tried fruitlessly to steer the election to Burr, a friend from the Berkshires, whom he assumed would be more malleable politically. Burr's guardian uncle, Timothy Edwards, had gone to live in the Berkshires in Stockbridge, in a house almost directly across the street from Theodore's own. Theodore had been one of very few politicians who'd remained a trusted friend of both men. Which is why Hamilton was writing to him as a good friend. We'll get back to that letter, but taken out of context, it may seem tangential, and unusually for Hamilton, wildly overblown. It is likely to defy expectations as to why Hamilton crossed the Hudson at daybreak and faced his doom. In a few choice sentences, Hamilton offered a better explanation about his part in the duel and a better prediction of what was to come of it than any other single document. That's my contention. I've always been interested in the letter of a dead man because, okay, Hamilton writes the letter, last thing he does, goes over to crosses the Hudson, gets shot, comes back and dies the next day. What happens to the letter? Who mails it? How is it mailed? And then when Theodore gets it, does he know that this has been written by a man who is now dead? Which news traveled faster? And we don't know the answers to any of these things, except we do know this, that Theodore never responded to the letter, and there was no one to respond to the letter to. When earlier members of the family encountered the letter, they could see its value to history, for several added sharply underlined notations as they passed the letter down to the next generation, and they're visible on the back of that sheet. All conveyed the same message. This letter must be preserved. That was the start of it. To be honest, I didn't think, my God, I've got to write about this. It was just instead one of those little tidbits that a writer comes across and then tucks away for later or for never, as the case may be. But my memoir came out, and I wrote a couple of other books, one of them on Whitey Bulger, another great man of our town. And I was starting to get itchy, a little bored with the present, as if this was all there was, and nothing had come before. The past to me was like this glittering pond. With the Sedgwick book, I had come down to the shore, and now I felt I was ready to take a swim. Coming from a historic family and having done the family memoir, I had already had a feel for the past. I thought I was ready to take on those harumphing Federalists in their buckled shoes. I've done many things, but I'm a journalist at heart, a journalist with novelistic inclinations. And to be honest, I wasn't interested in history per se, but in the stories that collectively make up the past, stories of large personalities in dramatic conflict, of character expressed through action. And if I was lucky, an almost Jamesian depth to the psychological dimension of my protagonists. I've always felt that psychology got short shrift in history, as if great men weren't a swirl of conflicting emotions like everyone else, and their deeds didn't come out of these depths as much as by historical circumstance. If history was a mystery, to me, it wasn't a whodunit, but a whydunit. Initially, I was intrigued by the notion of political violence, politics turned personal, lives on the line. An assassination, perhaps, I wondered? Something explosive? Kennedy, Lincoln, McKinley, Garfield, they'd all been done to death, one might almost say. Terrible to sort through history this way, deciding what stories deliver a bang. But then I remembered the letter. The Duel. Oddly, for all the supposed fame of the Duel, it wasn't much of a sharp memory for anyone I consulted. More a matter of hazy familiarity. This was before the famous musical, mind you, when Alexander Hamilton lived in some obscurity, and Aaron Burr worse than that. Honestly, many people weren't exactly sure who killed who, let alone why or where or how. And there was the essential publishing question: had the duel been done? It was obviously covered in all the biographies of the two men, but to my surprise, there had been no good book about it. Ron Chernow had done a masterful job with Hamilton, but that was just Hamilton. The best biography of Burr, by Milton Lomask, was about 30 years old. I was intrigued. I thought, two powerful, fascinating men from the dawn of the nation, joined forever in an act of appalling violence. This had possibilities. Oddly, it wasn't until then that I remembered Hamilton's letter to Theodore. It seemed just then as if it was actually a letter sent to me to find and read and ultimately to explain. I've come to think that, I really do think this, that there are wormholes in history, little magical chutes that connect the present to the past with extraordinary immediacy. I think that's the whole purpose of this institution, to make that connection, to make it immediate and felt. And that did it for me. This was the book for me. The Duel can easily be understood if viewed narrowly. Hamilton insulted Burr at a dinner party in Albany in February of 1804, calling him dangerous. An in-law at the event published an account of Hamilton's remarks in the New York Evening Post, the paper founded by Hamilton himself just 3 years before, the New York Post of today. And eventually, Burr happened across it. At that point, he was the sitting vice president. Burr being Burr, he was the sitting vice president with 2 illegitimate children, and he was constantly being dunned for their support. But Jefferson had dumped him as his VP for the next election. He was still stung over Burr's treatment of him. In the famous endless election of 1800, when he took 36 ballots in the House of Representatives to affirm what the country had intended, that Jefferson be president and not Burr. And Burr could have cut that off in a second just by saying what everybody knew, that Jefferson was the man, not him. But instead, he stayed up in Albany. He had his daughter's wedding to attend to. He didn't say a word about it to anyone, and he just let it go. That's the kind of guy he was. This is the presidency. To cover the ignominy, Burr had sought to be elected governor of New York. But Hamilton had politicked against him, and despite an early advantage, Burr lost by the widest margin in the short history of gubernatorial elections in New York. When he saw that Hamilton called him dangerous, it smarted. He called out Hamilton, demanding to know if he had used the term and what he meant by it. Worse, what did the in-law, a certain Dr. Cooper, mean when he said that he could relate still more despicable comments of Mr. Hamilton regarding Mr. Burr? Hamilton was in a bind. He could scarcely deny he'd used the word dangerous, or that he'd meant anything other than that he did indeed consider Burr dangerous, for he had been saying so in every election season since 1792, at mounting volume until he became rather shrill on the subject. As for despicable, he tried to wriggle that away by saying, there is despicable and despicable, and who's to say? It's like the meaning of is, right? Burr would have none of it. They would resolve their differences at Weehawken. It reminds me, that when in a duel, it never occurred to me until this moment, that it's so interesting when two lawyers are doing this, because the hair splitting on both sides and the fineness of argument and the way that the sort of gotcha moment is countered by the gotcha counter, and there are 11 letters, you should see them sometime, and that they go through the one by one, this slow, steady, inexorable process that leads them to their doom at Weehawken. But each one is a sort of desperate plight on the part of one to avoid the fate, and on the part of the other to insist that the fate be inflicted. It's quite something to see. A duel is, in odd way, like a romantic courtship, in that it has its etiquette too. It just goes the other way. Not a joining, but a parting. If a marriage declaration requires its preliminaries, so does a duel to the death. There's conversation, more serious conversation, the determination of interest by intermediaries, an offer, assent, choice of location, seconds, like best men. The guns are a little different, of course, but the intimacy in spacing is familiar. The two parties are not side by side at the altar, but facing each other at just 10 paces, close enough to see into each other's eyes, to discern any gratifying hints of distress. And then, instead of I do, the shout, present, which could be the last word that one of them would ever hear, or both. Bang, bang, or in this case, intriguingly, bang, bang. Hamilton is struck on his right side. The bullet pierces his liver. He's done for. He died of internal bleeding with his wife and 7 children grieving around his bed. Hamilton's life was over, but in some ways it actually just began, because like Christ, he rose again from the dead to assume a place in the firmament of American political history that he never would have attained if he had died quietly at age 80, as Burr did. His apotheosis was a triumph of political spin, for his team was able to sell the idea that bang, bang meant that Hamilton was a murder victim, not the loser in a duel of honor. More exactly, since this was a political matter, Hamilton was assassinated, a martyr. Hamilton had never shot to kill. He had fired spastically in the air after Burr shot him. That was the line. His second, Pendleton, even retrieved a branch overhead that he claimed to have been severed by Hamilton's ball. Joseph Ellis, however, has convincingly argued that the whole thing went down quite differently. Hamilton had indeed thrown away his fire, as he said he would, in his distaste for dueling. And remember, 3 years before, Hamilton's son had been killed in a duel, using the very same guns that Hamilton, the father, was using at Weehawken. And it could be argued, and had been argued, that he fell into a despondency, if not an outright depression, that led to this duel as a suicide by duel, rather than just a duel. But he shot, in any case, he did not shoot at Burr. That's almost certain. He shot well away from Burr. But Burr couldn't tell that he'd actually tried to miss, because how could he know? By the rules of the duel, Hamilton could not fire again until Burr had squeezed off his round. So Burr took his time. he aimed, and then he fired. This explanation doesn't go that much better for Burr, but at least he had stood up manfully to a gun he believed leveled in his direction. Whatever the explanation, he was not hailed as a hero for defending his honor, but indicted for murder by the Manhattan coroner who handled such things and been forced to flee the city. He traveled in disguise under an assumed name clear to Georgia to escape the newspapermen who sought to out him, and lawmen bent on arresting him for murder and hauling him back to Manhattan to face charges. The sitting vice president, Joe Biden? Hard to picture. Spiro Agnew, maybe. I know what you're thinking. Wouldn't it be nice if our present politicians could resolve their differences so easily? Whether it's bang bang or bang bang, it's over quickly without the terrible lingering of our own political controversies, like the one going on now between Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush. Perhaps you've been reading about it. No bickering, no tweets, just bang, you know? Has its appeal. The thing that's marvelous about a duel, I'll just tell you, is that it's very decisive, you know? I mean, it's binary, it's up or down, in or out, yes or no, dead or alive, bang. It's over. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why in times of war, that duels actually are welcome between officers, because otherwise they would have to go through the judicial process or of court martials that could be very elaborate and take forever. And so they dueled, and it was fine. And they were fairly good at it, being soldiers, and on they went, or one of them did. But a duel required an underlying assumption that does not exist today. And now we're going to go down one layer further into the question of why did they duel? And that's a matter so long gone from contemporary life that we hardly even recognize it, like some strange artifact dug up under a subway line for anthropologists to puzzle over. Honor. It all depended on something called honor. Anybody heard of it? Anybody seen honor in this city, any city? Not too much, you know, it's like gone. No one, I think it's fair to say, has honor anymore, certainly no politician, and certainly not honor that he would die to defend. But honor was everything to a gentleman of the political class of 1804. Honor was pride, masculinity, reputation, valor, lineage, and 100 other things. It was their brand, except that it was the product of a lifetime, not the calculation of marketers. It was everything they imagined for in they imagined they stood for in life. They would sooner surrender their manhood than give up their honor. When Hamilton assailed Burr as a dangerous man, he was impugning Burr's honor. No words can now convey how threatening that was. When Burr called Hamilton out on it, he was doing the same. It was time for an interview, as they called it, at the dueling ground. It's time for some water for me. The suspense. Now, how could these two canny inside players have gotten into such a sticky situation in the first place? Not why did they hate, but why did they hate so recklessly? Why could they not help themselves? They knew where the tripwire was, and yet they kept stepping closer to it. This took me almost 400 pages to explain, but the short of it is the two were at that point of maximum tension between sameness and difference. The differences? Hamilton was, of course, a penniless immigrant from the fly-speck West Indian island of Nevis. Burr, a near aristocrat, the son of Aaron Burr Sr., the president of Princeton, and the grandson of the most celebrated theologian of the day, Jonathan Edwards, and the closest that colonial America could come to a rock star. And it goes on from there. The differences would have pushed them apart into separate realms, but the similarities brought them together. Besides being both short, about 5'6", and slim, they were both brilliant, extremely articulate, perfectly educated, politically minded, ambitious, handsome, and immensely attractive to the ladies. That said, the differences again, the differences. Hamilton was prolix. He quick to dash off a 10,000-word treatise in an afternoon. And utterly transparent. He couldn't help himself. He always had to tell the truth. It was crippling, as it turned out. Burr was covert, a man of few words, and few of them written down, and many of those in code. He was the most hidden man imaginable. He seemed to wear a perpetual cowl over his head. Hamilton was a man of powerful ideology, so powerful it formed the basis of the first political party, the Federalists, and then inspired the second in furious opposition, originally the Anti-Federalists, later the Jeffersonians, and then the Republicans. Burr was a man without any deeply held political philosophy at all, leaving him open to a charge of demagoguery he could never quite dispel. And then there was this. Politically, the United States was a small place. I mean, it's amazing how small it was. I mean, Henry Adams writes about this in his, one of his histories, that if you were to look at America in about, even as late as 1800, that most of it was green. Little specks of it were the sort of cleared lands of urban centers, of which there were like 4, and they were not urban centers that we would recognize. This was little tiny dots in the wilderness. That was America back then. And these guys were like 2 of the greatest men in it. And they couldn't, for that reason, they couldn't escape each other. They kept, wherever they turned, there they were, be it in the revolution or in law or in politics. It was all the same story. Because of their talents and their ambition, they both rose in power and prominence. But if the reaches of power are an inverted cone, as they are, narrowing towards the tip, that perfect, unique spot at the top we call the president, eventually there was not room for both of them. They could not escape each other. They were 2 wolves in a tight cage, all fangs. And then there's this other part of it, which is that these were men who were, for the first time in their lives, both of them, not on the rise anymore. They had tipped. First Hamilton, then Burr. Hamilton couldn't, he was never a politically successful man for himself. He was elected only to assemblyman twice in New York, a tiny office. But he was a kingmaker, but he was not a kingmaker anymore. All of his people were losing. He had just had this catastrophic affair with Maria Reynolds, revealed to the nation to become an embarrassment. And then Burr had just been dumped as vice president and then fallen as governor. They were both men on the decline. Men who have been rising are dangerous when they start to fall. And I think that's another aspect to this. There's much more to it beyond that, but I want to swerve into the present for a second to answer the perennial question that authors face, which is, who cares? What does this story have to say about us today? And the answer, of course, is everything, right? Because I don't know if you've been reading about this political divide. The Republicans, the Democrats, the Tea Party, the Republicans. It's a fractious lot that Hamilton would have recognized very well. And then also we have examples in some of our most glorious political specimens these days seem to be people without any conviction whatsoever. And that is a kind of person that Hamilton would have recognized as well as being Burr types. These are constant issues in a democracy as to how much to trust the people to make wise choices, how much to insist that the real intelligence of a society is concentrated at the top. It's always the few, versus the many. And for Hamilton, it was the few that he trusted. It was the elite that he trusted. He thought they were smarter and better and more sensible. And now, of course, that we, in a democratic age, that we have entrusted our society correctly to the people, but it seems that at times the people can let us down, that they can either not vote or vote for people who others regard as cretins and worse. And like that. Now, these are familiar issues, and these were the issues that were very salient at the time. There's also something called Hamilton the Musical, which I hope you either have seen or are about to see or promise yourself that you will see before the decade is out, because right now, incredibly, they're taking ticket orders for not this January, next January. So, like, plan your life accordingly. And But it's so interesting to see this musical because it shows that Hamilton is still very pertinent, but it's a different kind of Hamilton from the one that I recognize. This is the Hamilton who's up from nothing. He's the scrappy immigrant. He's yee-haw. He's going to show them. Well, that's not really Hamilton. Hamilton, to me, is Hamiltonianism. It's what I was just talking about, is this ideological person who was like running countries and getting them all set up. And he was a big thinker, and he wasn't quite so scrappy. That said, it's wonderful to see the years of the Founding Fathers and the individuals of the Founding Fathers so evoked as they are, just in a crazy way, by that musical, the hip-hop musical. It's this incredible inversion by which lily-white founders are portrayed by actors of color, but they capture the founders better than any more literal portrait can do. Because the founders themselves, white was the default color. Everyone they knew was white. Now, whiteness is a political statement. It's about entitlement and nostalgia. And it takes color to get back to the original normal in a country that was all immigrants. So you get the sense of the fervor and also the craziness. And the dancing has a tumultuous energy that evokes a turbulent period when everything was new. Because too often we look back at this time and we think, this was all done in marble, and that everyone had the serene confidence of the Jefferson Memorial, and it's one big waxworks. And if you don't have to read much in this period to realize that that's not quite how it was. For most of the revolution, everything was going terribly, and the government might easily have foundered too. Success wasn't foregone conclusion. And one lesson of the duel is that governments are made up of men. And men are not always reliable. The founders were brilliant, but they could be foolish, headstrong, narrow-minded, vain, and everything else. Hamilton could be all of these, and Burr even more so. It was largely luck that if the individuals were imbalanced, the group was not. And I would say that one of the reasons that the Founding Fathers were as successful as they were was the penumbra of George Washington, who is one of the most serene and mature individuals that I've ever run across in history. But for him, all these squabbling children would have torn the place apart. I'm always surprised, too, when I talk about this book, how few people ever ask me anything about poor Aaron Burr. You know, it's like the Hamilton show, and there's no Burr in it, you know? But measured in Hamilton's terms of political accomplishment, Burr rates less than 0. I mean, there are things, and we can talk about them, but there were not many. I will confess, I found him much more fascinating than Hamilton. If there was a dinner party, and I had a chance at sitting next to Burr or sitting next to Hamilton, I would cuddle up to Burr every night. He would tell you stuff that would curl what hair you have. He's a marvel. And as Milton discovered, you know, Satan is the one you watch, right? And you remember, Gore Vidal did not write Hamilton. He wrote Burr. Hamilton can be too earnest, too clever, too bright to be much fun. A slacker and shameless libertine like Burr can become as a welcome relief. And I find the tale of his last years after the duel to be tremendously moving. Not his secessionary campaign, trying to detach half the American landmass for his personal empire. That's just nuts. But afterwards, when he is in exile in Europe and down to his last sou and trying to decide whether to spend it on bread or a prostitute, and deciding the prostitute. So now, that letter to Theodore, and I will close with this, and then I'd love to take some questions. Just to look at it, 3 things are striking. So by all means, do look at this. One, it's amazing to me that he could have written anything that was in the least bit coherent under the circumstances of going to face his worst enemy with a gun in the morning. Okay. Second, it's great penmanship. You got to admire that. And third, that it's unbelievably casual. That part that I read is like, hey, you know, I got a little correspondence to finish up. I mean, come on. But as the letter goes on, it gets deeper, and this is what Dennis was referring to at the beginning, that despite the circumstances, Hamilton did not refer to Burr by name. He doesn't come up once. But the allusion to Burr is unmistakable when he declares that it would break his heart if the country were dismembered. At the time, Burr had been linked to the so-called Northern Conspiracy to break the New England states, plus New York, free of the Union as a separate country to be headed up by Aaron Burr. That never materialized, but Burr did, of course, embark on that Western conspiracy, going after the lands of the Louisiana Purchase for a private empire, and that was the most dangerous secessionary campaign up until the Civil War. That led to Jefferson's charges of treason against Burr, placing Burr in the odd position of having killed the head of one party and possibly to be killed by the head of the other. Hard to pull off. And in the letter to Theodore, Hamilton inveighed against democracy, surely an awkward reference from a founder of the Republic. But democracy was not the hallowed term it is now, where universal franchise is revered, even if it is not always exercised, but contained the specter of an ignorant electorate that was open to manipulation by the unscrupulous, rather like now, I might add. He meant something closer to demagoguery with Burr, who was the first to engage in door-to-door retail politics. He was the demagogue in question. He believed in nothing, so thought Hamilton. If this was so, it offers an interesting gloss on the standard account. This duel wasn't purely personal or even a matter of honor or mano a mano or anything like that. It was, in fact, the first battle in a war that Hamilton was waging against Burr and all he stood for. To learn about Hamilton and Burr is to learn about America, yes, but also about the emotions that are always teeming under the surface of great leaders. Jealousy, ego, insecurity, ambition, lust. These are the passions that make people who they are and account for what they do. To identify them, to trace their source, and to see their consequence, that is, I think, the real work of history. And they're what I sought to capture in my book, War of Two. Thanks very much. Now, I'd be happy if there's time and if you're interested in my doing this to take questions. Easy ones first, the more difficult ones later when I'm sort of warmed up. Yes, you with the wonderful necktie. Oh.
If we knew that he didn't really want to try to kill Burr, and he knew that Burr was a vindictive man who would try to kill him, why doesn't the suicide argument, de facto suicide, make a lot of sense?
It does make a lot of sense. I mean, as you say it. I think that one of the things that happens in a duel is that people don't, in the heat of the moment, truly think it through. And I also think that sometimes what can happen when you're deeply depressed or in mourning is that you're incapable of making a sensible choice. That there are many things that Hamilton... Can people pick up on this if the mic is down here? Is that okay? Okay. Is that better? I don't want the people in Iowa and California not to be able to hear me. I think he wasn't thinking clearly, quite honestly, and I think in some ways I hadn't thought of it until this moment, but there's something delusional about the letter, you know. Hey, I got your letter, you know, I just got a few minutes here and I'm going to dash off a letter. It's like, he has no idea that this is a fateful time for him. And of course, history is unfair because we see it from what happened. He doesn't know what's about to happen. But he does know it's going to be a bad situation with him and Burr and two guns. So to answer the question, I think that there clearly, I mean, you can't enter a duel without a suicidal impulse because the chances are decent that you're going to get shot. And so you have to keep, that has to be on your mind. I mean, I will say, and then we'll ask, I don't want to just monopolize this, but I find it staggering that anybody could engage in this. If I'd had a copy of my book, I would have, which I don't have, but I would read a little passage from this, just describing what it was like. But the thing is that, you know, they stood like this. They stood sideways, and in order to minimize their outline, they wore a cape to make it unclear where their actual body was. They put their shoulder up like this to try and protect their chin. All to no effect, you know. I mean, they're just 10 yards apart, you know. I mean, you're not. It's only out of just this wild anxiety, which is natural in the moment, that people are unable to really aim and shoot. But the whole thing is just so crackers that it's hard to think of it in logical terms. Anything else? Yes.
Do you think that if Hamilton...
Oh, whoops, you have to use the mic, apparently, for the...
Do you think that Hamilton, giving away his shot, thought that Burr would give away his shot?
You know, I think that's a very good idea, but you would think he would say something about it because it may just look like gunfire to him, and it did. Again, it's all about the craziness of this setup of honor gone berserk. I mean, of people feeling such a monumental desire to defend something that is abstract to everybody else but them. I think that that's a setup for some rather inconsistent behavior. Because, I mean, again, think about it. That by what standard of honor can you kill somebody? You know? I mean, at all. It just... that is not in wartime, or they are not any actual threat to you. It's really, you know, again, we can't get in the heads of these people, but looking at it from where we do, that this is bizarre. And it's hard for a bizarre situation like that to untangle its logic because we just can't see it. We can't grasp the fundamental motivation. At least I can't. I mean, I can describe it, I can discuss it, but I can't get it, and I could never place myself in that situation. And I don't think anybody in this room could either. Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit about Hamilton's long-suffering wife? I believe he had married off socially.
Yes.
They sort of unbelievable that having had son engaged in Duel 3 years before, that, you know, did she ever express herself?
Well, Eliza, or called Betsy, they're use both names. I use Betsy in the book. Others use Eliza. She was highborn. She was the daughter of General Schuyler, who was one of the great Albany families that sort of ruled New York, and that he was, as well as being a rich landowner, that he was a heavy in the Revolutionary Army. So that when Eliza appeared before Hamilton at a little Christmas party in the wilderness during the war, that he's absolutely transfixed. You don't know what he is seeing. Is he seeing money? Or is he seeing beauty? Or is he seeing kindness? Or what? I mean, that it's not obvious. And he had written this odd letter that I go on about in the book to his great friend John Lawrence, who is a fellow aide-de-camp, in which he describes in detail the characteristics of the woman that he seeks. And it's a particularly complicated letter, first because it's so literal that it seems childish. You know, she needs to have it's almost like this inch busts and that inch hips. I mean, it's like that. But that he also he'd written another letter to Lawrence that had all the earmarks of a really heavy schoolboy crush, in which he referred to his love for Lawrence that went beyond the love that he had for anybody else. And it's actually a letter that gay rights groups have, captured for the internet to show that Hamilton was gay. I mean, possible. I mean, we're all a little gay. Well, not all of us. But anyway, so that's all to say that his interest in Eliza was complex. But that does not deny the fact that Eliza, I would say, is the moral center of his universe, and one of the moral centers of the universes in which he acted. She was the kindest, most loving, most forgiving, most understanding woman that one could ever know. And that what she put up with from her man is extraordinary. There was the most embarrassing revelations about this love affair that he had with a tramp, basically, Maria Reynolds. And that she forgave him for that. She didn't even mention it to him, practically, as far as we know. That allowed him to come back into the bosom of the family, which he craved. And that when he died in this duel that killed her to witness and experience, having seen her oldest son be killed in exactly this manner before, that must have been so galling, and yet she lives out the rest of her days bent on redeeming and affirming his memory, and that no man stood higher in the annals of history than Alexander Hamilton in her mind. It's a glorious thing.
One more question?
Well, John, thank you for a wonderful talk. It's been so enjoyable, so scintillating. My question is about the idea of duels, and to what extent were duels commonplace? And was this duel between two high-positioned government officials unusual in 1804?
No, that was not unusual. I think I don't know exactly what the count was, but I venture to say that in the 30-year period surrounding 1804, that there were probably 100 duels fought in the greater New York area. All of them, by the way, in New Jersey, because then as now, that you can do things in New Jersey that you can't do in Manhattan, even though they're equally illegal. And so that they would go across to Weehawken and do their battle there, and they would assume that everything would be fine. But in this case, of course, it wasn't. But yeah, I mean, there was no... It was this code that doesn't exist today because honor doesn't exist, and therefore the need to defend it doesn't exist. And for that reason, it's just unimaginable to us. But at that time, it was so ritualized and so automatic. And I think, frankly, that there were duels because there was an etiquette of dueling, that there was a process for dueling, that nobody would have thought a priori to go, let's have a duel to settle this. Let's shoot each other at 10 paces. No, that they knew that this was done, and therefore it was done. And I think this happens at times, where it's a sort of a cult situation, that more largely, where a culture buys into a notion that at any other time with any other group of people would seem utterly bizarre, and yet to them seemed as inevitable as sunrise.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you very much.
Thank all of you. There are copies of his book, if you'd like to purchase one, in the front hall, and he'll be glad to sign them for you afterwards. And again, we welcome you to come up and take a look at the letters that we have up here. And again, if you want to become a member, there are brochures out in front. Thank you.
And you're watching 48 hours of nonfiction authors and books on C-SPAN's Book TV, television for serious readers.
Microsoft founder Bill Gates reads close to 50 books a year and writes a blog in which he reviews several of his selections. Here's some of what Mr. Gates read in 2015. In March, he reviewed Northwestern University's Eula Biss's study on immunization and says, in an era when trust in just about every institution is waning, those of us who are working to increase vaccination rates face a daunting convergence of fears. In May, Mr. Gates weighed in on Richard Dawkins' book, The Magic of Reality. He writes, an engaging, well-illustrated science textbook offering compelling answers to big questions, and regrets that some people may not read this book because of Dawkins' strong views on religion. He also read and reviewed Jeremy Smith's book about Dr. Chris Murray, who is creating a comprehensive database of the global burden of disease, an issue the Microsoft founder is passionate about. In his synopsis of the book, he writes that Dr. Murray's work is another example of how technology is making it easier to save and improve lives everywhere. Evan Thomas's biography of Richard Nixon was a Gates selection in December. He points out that it's refreshing to see a more balanced account of Nixon. I wouldn't call it a sympathetic portrait. In many ways, Nixon was a deeply unsympathetic person, but it is an empathetic one. And closing out this year, Bill Gates chose to review New York Times columnist David Brooks' examination of personal character, which allowed him to reflect on his own life. You could argue that my work with Microsoft was a classic case of resume building, but I found deep satisfaction in that work. And, on the other hand, some might see my foundation work as based on eulogy virtues. But I would be lying if I said that I don't also get a small boost of career-oriented satisfaction when that work goes well. That's a look at some of the books Bill Gates read last year. You can read his full reviews of these books and others at his blog, gatesnotes.com.
The fascist militarist states of the Axis in World War II believed that the democracies, if you put enough stress on them, would break. And in a sense, World War II was fought on that proposition. And instead, what we found was it was the democracies that stood up under the strain, and it was the Axis authoritarian militarist model that broke. World War II was a struggle between competing visions of how to organize a society. I've spent a lot of time in my first two books, and I will spend quite a bit more in my third book, paying attention to the issues of media, press, propaganda, how the war was presented to the civilian populations of the various countries. This is a subject that I believe is very important. It has received surprisingly little attention in the literature of World War II. Why another history of the Pacific War? There's a certain amount of fatigue which I've detected, and indeed I share, with just the enormous pile of books that have been published that continue to come out every year. World War II is, in a sense, overpublished. If you look just at the number of books published about certainly the war in Europe, but also the war in the Pacific, the sheer number of them is rather impressive. Every aspect of the Pacific campaign has received a good deal of attention, so it certainly is a mature literature. I think what's happened, particularly in the case of the Pacific War, is that there has been a tendency to slice the subject into smaller and smaller pieces, and then to focus very deeply on those individual pieces. So what you have is relentless specialization, and what that results in over time is a literature which is very rich, but also very piecemeal. And this has been a larger problem, I think, in this world of military history. It's treated somewhat as a subgenre, perhaps even as a kind of ghetto, hermetically sealed off from other important aspects of history. It has been neglected in the halls of academia, and there are various reasons for that, perhaps because there is this lingering view that to study is to glorify. And I remember a review of Six Frigates, my first book, which was basically a friendly review, but the reviewer said Toll occasionally strays out of his lane, out of the lane that he should stay in, which is naval history, into these other areas of politics and diplomacy and even economics. Well, I agree that I do stray out of my lane. I've continued to do that, and I will continue to do it in the future. I think the stay in your lane mentality has been a problem in military history, even more so in naval history, which has often been treated as a subgenre of a subgenre, much of it written by scholars who are in one way or another affiliated with the U.S. Navy. The Pacific War has larger dimensions which deserve our attention. The politics of the war, the diplomacy, the issues in managing a global coalition, foreign policy, social history, press and propaganda, the organization of the economy for war production, the planning for the post-war future in Asia. All of these are important subjects that are usually completely omitted in military histories of this conflict.
You can watch this and other programs online at booktv.org.
Here's a look at some books that are being published this week. In The Idealist, Slate magazine correspondent Justin Peters profiles the late Reddit founder Aaron Swartz. Politico's David Greenberg looks at the history of spin in presidential politics in Republic of Spin. In The Fight, former Secret Service agent Dan Bongino criticizes the Obama administration's national security policies. Jeffrey Cowan explores Theodore Roosevelt's